Hello and welcome everyone. This is Sarah Sladen, Director of the Youth Economic Opportunities Network at Making Sense International, and we thank you for joining us for today's discussion, co-hosted by the Youth Employment Funders Group, YEFG, and to our speakers for taking the time to share your expertise on strategies for the integration of soft skills learning in formal education systems. The YEO Network is a global hub dedicated to advancing knowledge exchange, collaboration, and action among stakeholders working to expand youth economic opportunities. And today's webinar is part of our Apply It webinar series, one of 4 interconnected learning activities from around Webinar participants, we welcome your questions and contributions throughout this virtual learning event. Please write them in the chat box that is located at the bottom of your screen. We also welcome your tweeting and Facebook posts on key points you take away from this event using the hashtag GYEO. Our moderator for today's event is Nancy Taggart, Senior Youth and Workforce Advisor at USAID. Nancy is a member of the steering committee of YEFG and has over 15 years of experience managing international education, youth workforce, and gender programs. Prior to USAID, she worked at the Education Development Center as the Youth Technical Team Leader and Project Director for several youth workforce programs. And from 2010 to 2012, she served as Deputy Director of the Equip 3 program, which supported youth education and training projects. Previously, Nancy served as Project Director at the International Youth Foundation for youth programs in Morocco and Tanzania. So with that, Nancy, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our speakers and take us away.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Sarah. I am very pleased to facilitate this session as a representative of USAID and also the Youth Employment Funders Group. Just a little bit of background on the Youth Employment Funders Group. We are a donor network devoted to coordination and leveraging of best practices in the area of youth employment programming and coming together to exchange learnings and try to co-invest where possible on key areas for the sector. So we proposed to organize this session to Making Sense, and thank you very much, Making Sense, for supporting us in this session, to really follow on the release of our publication, What Works in Soft Skills Development for Youth Employment. And we released this publication to coincide with the GYEO in September, and we were really pleased to do that. There seems to have been really great uptake of the publication. But we also wanted to give some more attention and some more opportunity for discussion to the area of recommendations in the report that are focused on deepening reform efforts. And this is related to reforming education system and integrating soft skills into education systems and formal education. We really wanted to talk more about what is the experience in this area, what has worked, what hasn't. And so we thought that having a webinar that highlighted a few efforts in this area would be enriching for many of us. So
Hey everyone, I think we've lost Nancy there for a second. We're just working on reconnecting her. Give us
Hi everyone, sorry about that. Annie, do you want to pick up and go on to your part of the presentation, and then when we get Nancy back, we'll have her finish off.
Sure, that's definitely possible, Anna. So hello everyone, my name is Annie Alcid, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Party of EDC's Akazi Kanoze programs in Rwanda. And my presentation today is going to look at some examples of what we've done with scaling and institutionalization of soft skills around the world. And we've actually been working on soft skills in Rwanda since 2008, and even longer in other countries. So basically this is just going to give an overarching view of how we've worked in over 20 countries around the world in various forms of institutionalization of soft skills. And I want to ground my presentation in a scaling framework. And this is an adaptation by Cooley and Lin of Cooley and Lin's framework. And this is what EDC is applying to our work for a couple of key reasons. The first one is that it's project-based. So as you can see on the horizontal axis, Project 1 through Project 3, that they're quite frequently in our situation as NGOs, we don't work on open-ended projects, but we work through finite projects. Sorry, I think I've lost the presentation.
Sorry about that. We just lost.
I'll continue. But we work project-based.
Sorry about that, everyone.
Okay. So we work through project-based donor funding, which means that we're always faced with the challenge of going from project to project, even if we're working towards a scaling target. And second of all, the vertical axis on this framework is showing impact. And that's quite unique, actually. When we reviewed a lot of scaling frameworks, some of them had numbers. And for sustainability purposes, it's not scaling for scaling's sake, but it's scaling to increase impact. And as you can see, at the end of each project, the impact plateauing or the impact decreasing. So the plateau is the gray line, and that might sometimes happen between projects or even for the entirety of a project. But the yellow line is really what organizations are trying to prevent, is that the decrease of impact once a project ends or once an NGO steps back from implementation. And along the bottom you see innovation, learning, and scale up. Innovation is where it starts. What new thing do you bring to the table? And then through the learning and scaling up phase, there are drivers and spaces. And you'll hear me reference these throughout the presentation. An example of a driver is champions, external champions or internal champions. And spaces are those enabling factors that are helping you take that innovation to scale. I'll be going through two examples of scaling up. And these are very different contexts. One is in Rwanda and one is in the Philippines. And they take unique pathways towards institutionalization. The first example is the scaling up of the Akazi Kanoze program in Rwanda. It started in 2009 through USAID-funded Akazi Kanoze 1 program. And this was out-of-school youth only. And there's three key things here. The first is that there was an innovation, and that was the work readiness curriculum that was designed. It's 100 hours, it's 8 modules, and it brought to the forefront this idea of what work readiness was and how important soft skills were to employers. That was the first time that had been discussed in Rwanda, especially bringing together the education sector and the private sector to talk about what education systems were doing and were they market and demand driven according to what the private sector was looking for. And we conducted an impact evaluation that substantiated the anecdotal evidence. And it found that Akazi Kanoze youth were more likely to be employed and more likely to increase their soft skills. And this was the evidence that we brought to the table to be able to create political buy-in and find those champions that were going to move this forward. And in 2012, we conducted an in-school pilot. It was very small. It was only 50 TVET youth. But this was really the foundation for the second program, Akazi Kanoze 2, which is CIPSI-funded MasterCard Foundation program. And this moved the soft skills into the formal education system. And actually, the 3-year project we divide into 2 phases. The first one is the phase before the curriculum scaled up. And that was when EDC was invited by the Ministry of Education to participate in the curriculum reform. So there was actually this external catalyst that caused the scale up to happen. This national curriculum review was happening, and EDC was invited. There was a political space that was available because we had these champions who were recommending that EDC sit at the table throughout the revision process. And the second phase of Akazi Kanoze 2 is when the curriculum was actually taken to scale. And that was in 2016. And through the scaling process with soft skills, as we realized that there are gaps and there are challenges. So the innovation doesn't just stop there, but that one has to adapt as you go with scaling. So in the last year of the project, we actually created a few new innovations that we're only piloting at this point. And the one that I want to mention is called work-based learning. And that was enhancing the school-to-work transition process. So basically, we were looking at how youth who are in school can get more exposure to workplace and practice their soft skills in real workplaces before they transition to the workforce. It helps them get experience, but also helps them make better choices as they go into wage or entrepreneurship. And with Akazi Kanoze 2, we also did an impact evaluation. And we found that Akazi Kanoze closed the gender gap on employment. So here's again, there's more evidence that this is working in the school system. And youth had increased confidence. And additionally, we did a cost analysis that showed the Ministry of Education how much this was going to cost over the next 5 years. And just last year, we started another USAID project which took us, again, out of school. And this is another dimension of scaling. It's not always about institutionalization, but here we're moving from in-school to out of school quite fluidly because the curriculum is flexible and market-driven. So Huguka Dukore is focusing mostly on agribusiness. And additionally, there's a huge component of capacity building of the local NGO that was created in 2014. So again, trying to create sustainability for moving soft skills forward even when EDC takes a step back. So I want to check in. I see Nancy Taggart on the line again. Would you like to continue, Nancy?
Hi, Annie. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Nancy. Would you like to continue?
Okay. I didn't want to interrupt you. Yeah, I mean, I guess at this point I'll just say, I don't know at what point I got cut off, but basically I did want to just say a minute about, if not even that at this point, just to frame the purpose of the session. So I was going to do that after your session, but thanks, Annie. Basically, YEFG really wanted to do a follow-on discussion to the release of our report in order to give a little bit more attention to some of these issues related to reform of education systems and integrating soft skills into curriculum. So you may or may not have heard that, but that's really the purpose of this, is to go a little deeper into what that really looks like. What does it take? And you're already starting to talk about that, Annie, which is great. So we're going to hear from EDC's experience in Rwanda principally, but perhaps some other country experiences, and then we're going to hear from Educate and their team and their experience also in Rwanda, but as well in Uganda, where they started their work, and then in Kenya. And we're going to hopefully hear from a young person who's graduated from their program in Uganda, a young woman named Abigail, who's going to talk about her perspectives from participating in the program and now serving as a mentor. So I am not going to talk further at this point, but look forward to hearing more from you, Annie and Boris and your team. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. So basically, I can also highlight within this timeline that we partnered with Educate in the Akazi Kanoze 2 program. So there's a lot of synergies across what we'll be talking about. And that scaling up to the national level really is a team effort. So right now, EDC's work readiness curriculum is being implemented not only in general secondary schools, but also in the TVET system. So there's actually 2 different curricula that we've created within Rwanda, and that's part of it is that it has to be adaptable, and because every education system is going to require different market-driven skills, but also just the structure of every system it looks different. So even within Rwanda, we've partnered with Educate on the general secondary school side of the Ministry of Education, but we also have been working within the Workforce Development Authority for the integration of the curriculum in the TVET system. And this process has looked quite different from what has been happening in the Philippines. And that's my next example, is that I just want to create this juxtaposition because there's really, in EDC's experience, there's no clear cookie-cutter pathway to scale up or to integration of soft skills. And in the Philippines, it actually started even earlier than Rwanda in 2007 in the Equals 2 project. And this was a 100,000 out-of-school youth program. And this is pre-curriculum, and that's why we call it Phase 1. It wasn't a pilot because 100,000 youth is definitely a large number for out-of-school youth. But this was the foundation for creating a partnership with the Department of Education and TESDA, which is the technical education sector of the Department of Education. So creating this policy space, even as it works with out-of-school youth. And something that's unique about Rwanda, or about the Philippines, is that the Ministry of Education is inclusive of out-of-school youth through TESDA. So even working with out-of-school youth created a lot of buy-in in the Department of Education for moving into schools. And in 2013, the Mindanao Youth for Development project started, and this is still remaining with out-of-school youth. But 2 things to point out here is that in the Philippines, they've used the Work Ready Now credential test. And so along with the curriculum has also come a soft skills assessment that is linked to EDC's curriculum. And so far, they've tested over 1,000 youth through MyDev, and there's plans to scale up the use of the credential test. And another unique piece about MyDev is these out-of-school youth development alliances. In Rwanda, the drive, the space for scale-up really started at the national level with the National Curriculum Review. But actually in MyDev, it started at the local level with these out-of-school youth development alliances. And they bring together the local government, civil society organizations, private sector, youth, other community members to talk about including out-of-school youth, getting them employment and how to train them and include them in the workforce. And so this has increased youth perceptions of inclusion. So they report that the government and community have improved perceptions as well of including out-of-school youth, seeing them as assets to the community. And so this has really garnered support at the local political space that is trickling up. So this is, in pretty stark contrast to how the scaling up pathway happened in Rwanda. And then in 2014, through JP Morgan funding, there is a small project that started with in-school youth. And this is working in Indonesia and the Philippines. And it's a pilot, but yet again, here it is an adaptation to 2 countries, 2 languages, and piloting it for a different context. And lastly, in the extension of MyDev, again, small numbers, But what it's going to be focusing on in the next 2 years is how to work with the Department of Education and TESDA to ensure the quality and the assessment of the curriculum before scale-up. So really focusing on evidence and quality before taking it to national scale in the Philippines. If we take a step back and look at the world map of where ADC has worked, it's been 20 countries where we've adapted the soft skills curriculum, and it's always been a market-driven adaptation. And additionally, we have a soft skills assessment that goes along with it. There's one that's tied to the curriculum, but other assessments that are internationally reliable that control for cultural biases in soft skills. So not just the implementation of the curriculum on one hand within systems, but also how do we assess that, not just through impact evaluations, but also getting the teachers and the ministries to start assessing soft skills in addition to oftentimes the hard skills that are already being assessed. And throughout our work in these 20 countries, we have some key lessons learned. And the first one is innovation and experimentation, because the innovation in this case was the Work Ready Now curriculum and its flexibility. And it's always been market-driven in nature. So that has basically allowed us to get buy-in from not just the education sectors, but also linking to the private sectors. Number two is evidence is key in gaining buy-in. As you've seen in the presentation that we've done impact evaluations, we have assessments that we've been building because there has to be continuous learning and dissemination of that evidence to create buy-in from local to national level. And three, alignment with national and local policy and priorities is critical. So soft skills are in huge demand by employers and also now by ministries of education as they're trying to create more competency-based curriculum. And with high youth unemployment in many countries, soft skills are oftentimes a top priority. But as we saw in the Philippines, it started at the local level. So even there, how do you create buy-in? Are soft skills a priority at the local level? You would have to assess. It doesn't always just start with the national level, but can be different pathways for scaling. And that leads me to the fourth lesson learned is really there's no cookie cutter framework for scaling. There has to be flexibility. And the market-driven approach has been very successful. So for example, in Senegal, they wanted digital literacy added in. In the Philippines, there's been a module on civic engagement added. So really, what is the environment asking for and responding to that need with soft skills? And to conclude, these are some of EDC's best practices for scaling and institutionalization. So starting with the foundation of evidence and advocacy and moving on to an innovative curriculum. What is the innovation you're bringing to the table? And long-term partnerships, as you've seen in both these examples, it's been almost a decade or over a decade in both Rwanda and the Philippines. And so not only creating the long-term partnerships with EDC, but also making sure that we create local NGOs that are going to continue implementing after EDC steps back, or that we're enabling the system to do that as well. And policy and system strengthening is exactly that. It's not just the government, but it's also civil society and the private sector. Vision for scale and sustainability. This is if you start from the beginning, if you start with the end in mind, then you have to think about, is it a horizontal scaling, which is basically spreading geographically or having other organizations pick up your soft skills training, or is it vertically, as Nancy Taggart was talking about, with integration of soft skills in national curricula. It depends on the environment, and it depends on what the demands are at the policy level. And lastly, we created an assessment, and this is going to just be a resource that will be distributed after the webinar, but this assessment is looking at these components that I've been talking through already, and is a resource if your organization is thinking about scaling up or is wondering if you're on the right scaling path. So this is just a resource that I wanted to mention. Thank you for your attention. And additionally, we have extra resources in the slide deck if you're interested in learning more about these scaling frameworks or EDC's institutionalization work. I welcome your questions at the end.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. I was just going to introduce Boris really quickly to give them enough time. I don't know if that got cut off when I was giving my introduction, so if it did, I wanted to introduce Boris Bulayev, who's the co-founder and executive director of Educate, based here in the U.S., and he will be joined by his colleague Donnelly Donaldson, who is the country director for Educate in Rwanda. And as I said a minute ago, we're also going to be hearing from one of the graduates from the Educate program in Uganda. Boris, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Annie. We have a lot of respect and admiration for the work EDC has done in Rwanda. We greatly appreciate your support of our partnership there, so it's wonderful to hear the full story. So I'm excited to share Educate's perspective on this topic. Our plan is to share a brief background of our work in Uganda and then discuss 4 principles for navigating reforms that we've come up with based on many lessons we've learned across Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda, where we're able to plug in and support in a small way the work happening in Rwanda on the groundbreaking competency-based curriculum reform by the Rwanda Education Board and EDC. And Donnelly and I will alternate once we get to the principles. And so Educate works to transform education to develop young leaders and entrepreneurs, and we really what that means to us is making education really practical and skills-based, so it directly leads to young people taking leadership initiatives, starting businesses, getting jobs, and ultimately improving their livelihoods. We work in 2 ways. We partner directly with schools, and then we also work to try to integrate what we do into education systems by partnering with governments to support their existing efforts to do so. When we work directly with schools, we deliver a skills course focused on leadership, entrepreneurship, and workforce readiness to about 40 students per school. Those students lead a business club that's open to the entire school. They're assessed through a portfolio, and that's delivered through a youth mentor with a bit of support, focus on teacher leadership in the school. This model has seen through a randomized controlled trial and more recently a quasi-experimental evaluation, a doubling of income for all students with a 2.5 increase for girls, which has been very exciting. Girls start from a lower place, which kind of contributes to the increase, but nonetheless it's been exciting to see that the extra effect of our gender equity work. Additionally, we've seen statistically significant increases in soft skills through small increases on self-advocacy and grit, as well as bigger increases on public speaking and leadership skills. With our direct-to-school program, next year, it will be in about 25% of secondary schools in Uganda, about over 750 schools, impacting over 30,000 students intensively, 100,000 plus through business clubs at a cost point of less than $75 all in per school. So we've been able to achieve great scale of this in Uganda and have gotten a fair bit of recognition for this, including being one of 14 case studies on scaling education globally alongside BRAC, Protham, and Teach for All from Brookings Institution. And so we have big dreams at Educate, and our North Star is to, by 2024, measurably impact 1 million youth annually across Africa. This means that we're creating impact on that many youth. Definitely a stretch goal for us, and right now we're impacting, as of next year we'll be impacting 30,000 in Uganda. And so when we think about getting to this goal, we see a big tidal wave of demand around skills and competency-based education reforms. There are 10 plus countries that are interested in making their education really aligned to life after school. And the opportunity we see for us is to is that the biggest reform challenge is making change in policy actually lead to change on the ground, and where we see adding values is just our experience in trying to do so. And so in grappling with this question of how do you integrate kind of a model like ours, which has a kind of foundation of soft skills into national education systems, the way we think about it is how do we map our direct delivery model onto the education system. So what is it exactly that, what does it all look like mapped onto the education system? And to start, I want to kind of show a framework of technical versus adaptive work. It's a framework that I think is really relevant for all of our work. Technical problems are ones where the problem is clear, the solution clear, and all you need is to bring expertise in. A good example is a broken arm. You just need somebody who knows how to fix broken arms. Adaptive problems are ones where the solution, and often even the problem itself, is unknown, and technical expertise won't necessarily solve it. The related example is a random pain in your arm that no one can really understand. I found this framework really illuminating to our work and how to understand reforms because in our experience it's not really a lack of technical ability, it's a lack of deeper understanding of what's going on and how to affect change within this context, within these complex systems. With these stakeholders, that's the challenge and where the focus needs to be. And so looking at a literature review, these types of reforms are really hard and often don't succeed. I think for us, we want to acknowledge that effective reforms are really hard and fail most times, and so we have to really grapple deeply with that in order to try to move forward. And so to try to do that, we've come up with a framework that outlines 4 challenges we've seen, along with 4 solutions, all driven by an evidence base we've seen globally. So the first challenge is that integration is even harder than implementation. Most reforms focus on alignment, do all the documents reinforce the same things, and this is crucial to success. However, this comprehensive approach can lead to teachers being overwhelmed if it's too much change all at once. And that's honestly understandable. When you think about what does it look like to get self-control skills integrated into a math class that already has 100 students with 1 teacher and an old whiteboard, it would be challenging even without the resource constraints. But it's especially challenging in this context, and so I think it's important to acknowledge that integration is hard, and we've seen how hard it is. And so our kind of principle to address that is to really fight for a few big wins. Ensure that there's comprehensive alignment on a few key changes instead of an overhaul of everything at once. And our view is that if you succeed at the first 3 to 5 big wins, you build momentum for even more change at a later stage. And so there are 2 big things we push for in reforms. The first and the biggest one is a framework called Skills Lab. We had our first reform experience in 2012 in Uganda when we were supporting the reform of upper secondary entrepreneurship, which is an elective subject for about 50,000 students. And we were able to integrate key components, including our curriculum, business club, and practical exam in support of that reform. And one of the things we learned is that content alone doesn't change what happens in the classroom, that there needs to be a pedagogical framework that locks in the move from rote memorization-based teaching to student-centered teaching. And so from that, a lot of challenging discussions came out Skills Lab. It's a framework called Build, Practice, Present, where students spend a third of their time building knowledge, a third of their time practicing in groups, and a third of the time presenting and engaging with each other. It's a really simple framework. It can apply to all subjects. The second thing that we push for in reforms are business clubs, where students actually start businesses together. And the idea is that the Skills Lab turns the classroom into a place where you're building soft skills through doing. They can apply to all subjects. They're very simple. And business clubs create a space where students can put those skills, as well as workforce readiness, into deeper practice so that the skills stick. And so through that fight for coherence, throughout Uganda, Rwanda, and soon Kenya, there are over 500 teachers using Skills Lab as a simplified approach to competency and skills-based teaching. This structured pedagogy takes less than 1 training day to learn. It's flexible enough to fit any subject content, but structured enough to ensure that research-based practices are adhered to in every single lesson. And the idea is that, again, it's really simple, but also really adaptable and has clear indicators. It's not trying to be over-prescriptive. Every teacher can make a lesson of their own. It's not 17 steps. It's 3 simple steps: build, practice, present. And it kind of comes from a viewpoint that we have that you have to get the complexity of your solution in that sweet spot. A lot of times certain actors will make solutions too complex, so it's too hard to adopt, or they might be too broad and not detailed enough, so there's not enough direction. And this, we believe, allows enough space for strategic space for adaptation and for teachers to really own this. With that, I'll pass off to Donnelly.
Thank you, Boris, and hello to everyone who is listening. So I think Boris did a really great job of explaining this pedagogical framework that we have been using in our countries of operation. And even though it's very simple, and teachers all agree it's simple and they see the benefits of it, as do students, another challenge that we encounter is that there's sometimes little will and skill to change. And so I think all of us have at some point in our lives tried to change a bad habit, and even though we have the knowledge that that habit may not be, it's not good for us, it still takes a lot of willpower and discipline to change our behavior. And so it's the same for teachers. They are trying to change their teaching practices, but it's difficult, especially because education reforms are often asking them to teach in a way that opposes the way that they were taught when they were in school, and then also how they were taught to teach. So, a practical example of this is most of us were taught by lecturers. We took notes and someone spoke to us for 2 hours and we wrote the notes down and we studied them. So it's very natural for us to default to that. There's a little will for us to change from that, even when we know we have this knowledge now that it's not the best way to teach, and we also don't necessarily have those skills to teach in a different way because we default to the way that we were taught. So, it requires a lot of teacher training in order to get teachers to change their behavior, and we've seen that in Rwanda with this, this example I'm just giving you of trying to support teachers through shifting to more learner-centered methods. The cost of teacher training is very prohibitive, so teachers are often not fully equipped to implement policy changes. So that gap between, the gap in will and skill is something that has to be aggressively addressed. And for those of us who are working in the education reform space, if we don't attack this problem aggressively, the reforms will live on paper, but they might never actually make it to students in the classroom. So given that challenge, it's really important for reform to be teacher-powered. So we often speak of student-centered education or learner-centered education, and it's important for us to remember the teachers are also learners in any reform process. So we need to have them be the center of the reform, just as we encourage them to make students the centers of their classroom and their pedagogy. Because teachers can reject reform. They can do it formally at a national level, or through their teacher associations, or they can do it informally by simply refusing or being unable to actually implement the reform, right? And that's why teacher trainings can be, they're so essential, and it becomes a problem because of how expensive they are. And in fact, sometimes a lot of money is invested in teacher trainings, but they're ineffective at convincing teachers to implement these reforms. But the success of education reforms really depend on teacher buy-in, and most teachers are influenced by other teachers. So teacher leadership is an investment that we have seen to be something that's really worthwhile. So the way to really best get teacher buy-in is to engage teachers, as many teachers as possible, directly in the design process of the reform, not making just a top-down reform, but engaging them in the design process, and then having teachers actually advocate to other teachers for those changes. So we have the structure here, which we call the LEAD Strategy for teachers, and this is how we put teachers at the center, or facilitate them being at the center of the reform process. Teachers should be learning from trainings and from documents provided to help them understand new policies, right? It's not enough to simply dictate a reform, but we have to provide opportunities for them to learn. Then we have to give them opportunities to experiment with the new methods. There must be safe places for them to make mistakes, for them to get familiar with the content, to ask questions. Then teachers have to be able to adjust the pedagogy as necessary. I think most of us know in the education space that personalizing something is really the key to developing mastery and ownership of that content. So teachers have to be free to adjust it. We cannot just force them to deliver something in the specific way which we want to dictate. And finally, the teachers should then be the ones to distribute the lessons they're learning within their schools and to their peers through their teaching associations and communities of practice, and also in the other spheres of influence with which they engage.
Great. So the challenge 3 is that complex system solutions are required. And going back to technical versus adaptive framework, these challenges are incredibly complex and deal with a major system that is very hard to understand. Harvard development economist Lam Pritchett has said the challenge of systems is that everyone can be an actor in a system without understanding how it works. And so our solution is designed for implementation. Here, again, based on the evidence base. And the idea is that you want to develop the curriculum through the process of piloting by directly using lessons and feedback from implementation in real classrooms with real students, because otherwise the solutions can be rejected by both actors. The challenge with just developing a curriculum and then piloting after is that you only make superficial changes, and curriculum development should be an ongoing, iterative, start and stop process during pilot implementation. And often students, despite being the key consumers of education reforms, are very directly involved in the process. So you need to focus more on the process of reform than the outcome. And that process must meaningfully engage teachers and students for it to be successful. So an example, in Kenya, they're doing a big education overhaul, and as part of this reform, they're interested in creating a new subject called community service learning that would be required for every student in the last 3 years of secondary, so up to 1.5 million students. And we're a technical advisor supporting the creation of the subject, and so the subject's curriculum development will engage teachers who are piloting the subject directly into formal curriculum development workshops. The Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development is working to deepen their efforts by engaging teachers who are piloting community service guidelines directly in formal curriculum development workshops. So they'll be able to get feedback throughout the process before it's finished, and they'll actually be on the panel providing feedback around it. Additionally, as a technical advisor, we're also going to engage students deeply and iteratively in the creation of curriculum. And all this is to say that teachers, when creating curriculum, it shouldn't be created all at once. It should be created piecemeal, so that along the way there's immediate relevant feedback that can be given by teachers and ideally students to ensure that it's adapted to the complexities of the environment. Donald?
So the fourth challenge is one that Annie has touched on in great great detail. She's already given us a very thorough analysis of the issues around scale and some really good recommendations and a template for how EDC has dealt with this challenge. So just to briefly add to what she said, it's really important to view an education reform as the beginning of an intensive process, right? So soft skills reform, or integrating soft skills into an education reform process, is not just about getting those new policies on the paper in a syllabus, for example, or in a textbook. But for true reform to happen, teachers have to learn how to change their practices, and we have to give them time to do that. So learning and change are both, they're very hard to do alone, and they're very time consuming. So one of the things that we have to think about when we're trying to integrate soft skills into curriculum is how are we going to ensure that the reform doesn't fade away when the cost of ongoing teacher training is so expensive. And so the way to do that is to create learning processes and communities that will sustain that change and strengthen the reform over time. So in Uganda, Educate does this through supporting teacher associations, facilitating teacher meetings where they are able to come together and share experiences and grow together and deepen their practice of learner-centered pedagogy. In Rwanda, we're very fortunate that the government drives this forward, and it's done so by actually creating master trainers at the sector level, which is the lowest geographic denomination, and then those sector trainers collaborate with teachers associations and communities of practice in their sectors and in their districts in order to determine the training needs of their fellow teachers and address them accordingly. So we have a really good foundation in Rwanda to develop teacher networks and learning communities, and we're able to map our program onto these communities and support their development in order to achieve a more sustainable program. So one of the ways that Educate does this is by facilitating what we call exchange visits. And these are opportunities for teachers to visit each other and to learn from each other. They observe each other teach, and they give each other constructive feedback. So this is a form of peer learning. And not only are they learning from each other, but it's a really great way for them to metacognitively model the learner-centered practices, the practice of getting feedback, the practices of public speaking, all of which are soft skills that perhaps they were not taught. Many of them would say they were not taught when they were becoming teachers, but now they're able to practice it, which helps them to better teach the students these same skills. So there's a double impact there of this exchange visit model. It's as you can see, it's not just a method for the teacher to learn, but it provides a safe space for the teacher to practice this new pedagogy, and it really aligns with some universal principles within education, which I think we can all agree on, and which is, which are lifelong learning and continuous professional development. So what the teacher has in his or her individual school, as you can see on the left of this slide, which is in this circle, which has these different sectors, the curriculum, which is the policies that the government has really provided in documentation. Then there's the teacher training and training of students, which the teacher is a part of, and then the business competitions all happen within the school. But then the teacher is able to expand his or her network and learning community when he or she goes out into another school and then demonstrates his or her learning practice, but also is able to evaluate peers in that scenario. And what we've seen is that this exchange visits method or strategy, coupled with the soft skills integrated into the curriculum, which Boris and Annie have talked about, have really led to some great results in both students and teachers. So we've seen students have significant increases in their own entrepreneurship efforts, which is exactly what the curriculum calls for. That's the spirit of this reform in Rwanda, is because we want to see more entrepreneurs in the country. A saying we often say is that we want to see more job creators instead of job seekers. And so these kind of results are really heartening because it's achieving exactly the vision that the government has set for these students and what these teachers and students even want for themselves. And we also have seen teachers substantially adopting more learner-centered practices, which is really impressive after just 2 terms when you consider that these teachers were not, as I mentioned before, they didn't learn to teach this way in their own teaching practice, and they were not taught this way. I think like most of us, they were being lectured to. So it's really heartening to see the very rapid progress and uptake that teachers have made. And I'll just give a brief success story, is a student that we have, Claudine, who is in a senior 5 here, and who, has really emphasized when we spoke to her how the reform has made such a difference in her life, because prior to this integration of soft skills into the curriculum, she went to class, she memorized facts, and then she went home and she was, she could regurgitate the facts, but she couldn't connect them to her educational, her life outside of school. School was one thing that was just very separate from her personal life. And through the soft skills implementation in the classroom, she learned how to make liquid soap as a part of her entrepreneurship class and through the exchange program. And she said that was a bit of, a spark for her, because she realized that she had the ability to create something that she could actually make an income from. And so it became a stepping stone for her, because she used that initial income to then buy raw materials to launch the businesses that she really cared about, which now is rearing goats. And I think this really speaks well to the power of teaching youth simple product making skills that they are then able to leverage and to launch other enterprises. And so the impact on students is definitely a great indicator so far. And then the impact on teachers, again, is also another indicator of success. And Claudine's entrepreneurship teacher actually said that this new curriculum is helping students to build self-confidence, to build teamwork, and to build innovation. And when people leave secondary school and they're on their own, they don't have to just wonder if they're not able to go to university, but they're able to have their own businesses. So, you see there a picture of a projector that was created by students, but we've seen them create everything from clean cook stoves to clothing to jewelry to agribusiness products, and it's really been great to see the students and teachers' excitement about really implementing these soft skills as they are supported through the work of EDC and Educate.
And what you're seeing here is actually a paper projector. And so just to wrap up, we'll get into it, but basically through all these 4 principles, we've mapped our direct program onto government. It splits out into certain things targeting the ministry through technical advisory, and certain things targeting schools, which we call education system support, and that's still very much a work in progress, but where we've ended up on kind of key lessons and key, at least theories for how to create effective skills-based reform. And so these are our 4 principles in the summary.
Thanks so much, Boris and Donnelly. That's excellent detail to some of these issues, and I know we have some questions coming in. Are we going to be able to hear from Abigail? We'd love to hear her thoughts.
All right. My name is Abigail Chukuri. I come from Eastern Uganda, that is Kapchura. I'm a mentor with Educate Uganda, and I've been a scholar for the last 2 years. I come from a village where there is female genital mutilation and there is girl child discrimination towards getting education. Life has not been easy because my father personally wanted me to get circumcised, then later on I get education. I battled with life. After senior 4, I managed to pass very well. I came to kinda a town school. Reaching that town school in senior 5, that's when I got Educate Uganda. Educate opened my eyes, and that's when I realized I have a chance to change where I come from. When I read this class, we were taught a lot of skills. First and foremost were the soft skills. Like for example, we were taught self-esteem, problem solving, communication, decision making, teamwork, critical thinking. And we would do this in groups. Our mentor used to put us in groups, and in these groups we would do these activities. Like for example, we had lessons like what makes a leader. I came to realize that a leader is made but not born. So in my own thinking, I knew that even if I come from such a district, I can still make it. We have things like problem solving. We had lessons like win-win solution. You realize that I was battling with my father, but if I didn't have the skills to decide and to do problem solving, I would be that victim who is already married. Then from there, in class we have these groups, and then in Educate, in the course we have what we call the leadership course, we have the entrepreneurship, and then we have the mentoring. So what we are taught in class, what are the soft skills, is what we implement in our business clubs. You realize that in our clubs we do it in groups. We have a business for making soap, we have a business for chapati, and these are the skills we implement. You realize that a group needs to know how to present, that is the epic speech. You realize that a group needs to have problem solving. I would have gone to school, I would have been taught very many subjects, but I would not be getting this, and I would not have managed to live that life that I was living now that I'm at campus. After senior 6, I got a chance. Our educator retained me to be a mentor, and I was very happy that I was going to implement what I have to show other girls that this is the way and we can make it. I became a mentor. I won the Educate scholarship, and life has been so good because I'm implementing the same thing that I got to my class. And I think this is all we can do for the girl child to make them a better man in this future. As the saying goes, educate a child is educating a nation. I'm a testimony for that, and educate is what I am, because what I talk is educate, what I think is educate. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Abigail. I think you touched on some of the issues that one of our questions that we've received wanted to address, which is looking at some of the impact differences on young women and young men who've been in the program. So it's excellent to hear your perspectives on that. From in that you have participated in it. So hearing kind of directly from you. I don't know, Boris and Donnelly, if you want to speak to that other question, and then Annie, hearing from your perspective, you touched on gender data a little bit in your presentation, but can you guys speak to this issue of lessons learned or different experiences in reaching boys and girls?
Yeah, I think we've done a fair bit of gender equity work. And we did a lot early on when we had to reinvest as we scale, just because we saw the dynamics changed. I guess key lessons would be that I mean, at every stage along the way there needs to be an emphasis on it, and if you don't proactively emphasize it, then the natural gender kind of norms will come into play. And so if we don't teach our staff, our mentors, and teachers kind of about these things, then it will be worn away. It needs to also be teacher-led. One of the things we've been pushing in the last couple of years are gender codes of conduct created by teachers within schools, and also really focusing on modeling the right behavior. So kind of the last challenge we're still dealing with is how do we get business clubs to be equally led by boys and girls. So really focusing on how do you create equity at every stage, and how do you kind of affect the behavior of every actor along the chain.
And I can talk a little bit about some of the the challenges with gender equity in Rwanda and the Philippines. So in the data that we saw at baseline is there was a over 20% employment gap between the female secondary school students and their male peers. And by end line for our randomized control trial, this was for general secondary school students and TVET students in Rwanda, is that in the treatment group, the young women caught up to their male peers to end at about 76% employed. And if you look at the control group, it's in stark contrast where the control group females only end where their male peers started. So they end still 20 points behind their male peers. And in our curriculum, one of the modules is focusing on gender, sexual reproductive health, and throughout the entire curriculum, there's the cross-cutting theme of leadership and equity. And in Rwanda, that's also a cross-cutting theme in the national curriculum. But in the adaptation across countries, we've even bolstered the focus on gender, sexual reproductive health within the curriculum. And with the evaluation, we can't pick apart which part of the curriculum is working towards closing the gender gap, but what we can see is that it is working overall, and that it's not just on employment, but it's also on soft skills. So it doesn't completely close the gap on soft skills because you see critical ones such as emotional stability and leadership qualities. Young women are still lagging behind their male peers from our findings. So I think that there needs to be even further focus, just as Boris was saying, basically, how do we prioritize that even more within soft skills to make sure that we can close the gap, because research across the board around the world shows that young women start further behind their male peers in key market-driven soft skills, especially on leadership and assertiveness. And when one of the most interesting findings for us is that young women and young men were applying for the same amount of jobs. So they were putting in the same amount of applications, but then when you looked at the amount who were going for interviews, that didn't translate to interviews for the young women. So what is happening between the application phase and the interview phase that is missing there for young women to get through to sitting across from an employer? So we're still doing a lot of qualitative research into these gender dynamics that we found in the quantitative data because I think it deserves a lot more exploration.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Annie. That's helpful, and thanks, Boris. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more we could dig into on that topic. I mean, I think what's interesting that you bring out, Annie, is the need to actually collect data on some of this. And so, you know, if we don't go that extra step to collect data on, you know, what are the differential impacts and skills that are being developed among the young women and among men, then we don't know where the gaps are. So that's allowing me to segue into one of the other questions that's come up, and maybe we can take this as the last question since we're past the hour, is related to assessing outcomes. And have there been tools used, standardized tools used for this? I know, Annie, you touched on that in your presentation. Boris, maybe you can start us off and talk a little bit about what tools you have used for assessing soft skills.
Yep.
And, yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. You know, I think assessing soft skills for all of us really is a work in progress. We have built and kind of citizen-led assessment-like tools for secondary for soft skills, for soft and practical skills, and it works statistically. And it's modeled off Propham's Asa and Owezo in East Africa. I think we're still struggling how to get it to speak to teachers and parents around what the results are. So that's been a big effort of ours. We're also working with FHI 360 on a soft skills tool. I'm less involved in that myself these days, but I think we've definitely made some progress and have seen some statistically significant results, but it's very much a work in progress.
At EDC, we actually have developed 3 assessments that we've been using across countries. The first one that I mentioned is called the Work Ready Now Credential Test. And this is, the strength in this is that it is very high reliability. When you do item analysis, the 3 forms are equated, and it works well linked to measuring what's in our curriculum. But the downside to that is that we found that it doesn't necessarily work in every single context. And then also that not every country is necessarily, or organization is going to be implementing the EDC Work Ready Now curriculum. So what that led us to do is actually working off of the Big 5 inventory and creating an anchored Big 5 inventory, which is a very reliable test across cultures. That's what I alluded to, the one that basically controls for cultural biases. And that's measuring conscientiousness, or how driven people are in work, agreeableness, empathy, teamwork, openness to learning, emotional stability, and extroversion. And we've tested that in 4 countries now, and we're continuing to use that. But again, the strength of that is that it's very reliable, and the beauty of it is that it controls for cultural biases. So we can compare Philippines to Honduras or Macedonia to Rwanda, and it gives direct feedback to employers and to students about where the mismatches between what employers are looking for and what students are looking for. And we recently did some research using photography as well to basically to explore this mismatch more, where we gave youth cameras and had them photograph the soft skills in their communities, and then we had them discuss this with employers. So trying to make sure we had qualitative data surrounding the anchored BFI quantitative data. And we basically found that, not surprisingly, which is pretty standard around the world, is there's a mismatch between what youth think the ideal employee should be, so what standard they have for themselves, versus what their teachers and employers are looking for. The teachers and employers have a higher ideal and standard for soft skills. But again, just that information going back to the students, which we've disseminated across the country, is that maybe what they think is the ideal is not actually the ideal. They have to work even harder to please and to meet the needs of their employers. So that in and of itself is just a really interesting realization for these youth. And then actually recently, in the past year, we started a new project funded through the SIPC collaborative, and that's measuring skills at scale. And because the downside of the anchored BFI is that it's very technical to analyze. So it does require statistical knowledge, which your average teacher will not have. So what we're doing is in the next year and a half creating a tool that again will be reliable across countries. It's being tested in 5 countries. And it's going to be a tool that's user-centered, user-friendly, and can be used in the classroom and scaled up by ministries and NGOs around the world. And that will be focusing on 5 of the soft skills that have been identified by the donors in the funder group and have been just verified worldwide by different researchers. So that will be coming out in the next year and a half. So hopefully that's going to be all open source. So if you're looking for a tool, we're really hoping that gains traction and can be scaled.
Thanks, Annie. So just to clarify, I think there are a couple tools. You highlighted one that you all are working on, and then Boris spoke to one that Educate is piloting in Uganda through an effort under Youth Power Action, which is also an open source tool. So I think this is excellent. There is more attention, as many of us know, going to this area, testing more tools, getting data tools out there. So to look at, are there to decide that there are now options and how to assess the outcomes from some of these programs. There are a lot of interesting questions coming up. I don't think we have time, unfortunately. I'm just going to flag them so that Annie and Boris are aware. There's clearly a clamoring for, concrete tools and strategies for how to do this kind of work, how to engage private sector. Dr. Zhang has been asking that. What are tools related to advocacy and having an advocacy strategy that, like what has been talked about today. How do we do this with governments, basically, and other key stakeholders in the countries we're working? Lots of questions related to incentives for teachers. I think that's an issue that's certainly come up in a lot of our work. So I don't know if we could just take maybe 1 minute, any kind of summary comments from both EDC and Educate, maybe touching on any of those themes, but I think we need
Sure. Yeah, I think tools are important, but I think ultimately governments are around, engaging governments is around trying to align to a problem they have, building deep relationships with them, and having them actually see the solution. I think a lot of times, at least in these types of reforms, there's not, governments might not even know exactly, they might be saying the right thing, but they don't know what it actually looks like. So sometimes the best thing you can do is to show them, show them live how what they're trying to achieve can be achieved. I think there'll be a lot more behind that once that happens. I think that's been really key to us in Kenya.
I would just
Nancy, I guess just one last thought on the question about incentives. Is that's definitely across the board a big challenge, which I know that both Educate and EDC ran into, especially when you're trying to institutionalize working, wanting to make it sustainable, not wanting to offer monetary incentives is really the key stickler there. Is it's difficult because to bring teachers into large trainings, oftentimes it's for the per diem. So basically, using a school-based model is a lot more sustainable. So bringing it to a level that doesn't require that high monetary and human resources is what we've had to do. And that's still in the pilot stage, but that's really where even the Ministry of Education here is moving towards that, moving away from these large-scale trainings, as Donnelly was talking about, and moving towards the school-based in-service training as a way of basically reducing the resources needed to do in-service training in Rwanda. And basically, this has been a big discussion at EDC about intrinsic motivation for teachers, and what is the way non-monetary incentives of basically building, as you're doing capacity building of a Ministry of Education, how do you build in the retention of teachers into the discussion on revision? Because it's not just about putting a curriculum or putting components into a curriculum, but it's about how do you assess on this and how do you retain your really good teachers. So I think thinking about the end, retaining those teachers long term, how do you assess long term, assess impact is really where you have to begin.
I would just reiterate the importance of keeping this whole process teacher-centered, resisting the urge to make decisions for teachers, and rather focusing on engaging them from the very beginning and through every stage of the process, because they can very often clearly articulate what they need, and they're often very willing partners in this process. And it's important for both policymakers and NGOs and social enterprises involved in this space to keep that in mind, that if we engage them in the process, we will really have more sustainable results in the long term.
Thank you, Donnelly, and thank you, Boris and Annie, and thank you so much, Nancy, for moderating, and for everyone for joining today's webinar. It's been a really interesting discussion, and as Anna pointed out, we will post this recording and the resources online at youtheconomicopportunities.org, and we'll send this out via email as well. In a few moments, we're going to direct everyone to a quick survey. It takes less than 2 minutes, but we would really appreciate it if you could fill it out so that we can be sure to create the most relevant and interesting learning events going forward. So thank you again for your time, and have a great rest of your week.